What's the deal with smell and COVID? Loss of smell is called anosmia, and sometimes with COVID, you lose your sense of smell. But we're going to have to go to the actual olfactory epithelium in the nasal cavity to find out what's going on. So that's what this picture is at the roof of our nasal cavity, we have olfactory neurons, and olfaction just means smell. So these are the actual cells that do the smelling. These olfactory, these blue neurons, these cilia actually protrude into the mucus layer, and odorants will dissolve into the mucus, and then there's receptors on these cilia that the odorants will bind to and open up ion channels that'll depolarize that olfactory neuron, and it'll send its impulses up nerve fibers that travel through the base of our skull. It's called the ethmoid bone, and this is called the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, where it has little openings for these olfaction nerve fibers to go up. And there'll be an olfactory bulb here, and it'll carry through the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve number 1, to the olfactory cortex, and we'll perceive smell. That's kind of how this works. Some of these other cells, we have supporting cells in red. They're called sustentacular cells, and they support, and they're intimately related with those olfactory neurons. Then we have basal cells down here that just kind of another supportive cell, but not as important. And here we have a Bowman's gland, and that's secreting the mucus that covers the surface of the epithelium. Epithelium is just a covering. And so this is actually a neuron that's going through mitosis. So these olfactory neurons are constantly, being regenerated. So what happens with COVID? One of these cells, and it's only the red ones, the supporting cells, make ACE2, which stands for angiotensin converting enzyme 2, and it's on the surface. And this is really important. The olfactory neurons, the basal cells, they don't have this ACE2 enzyme on their cell surface. Only the sustentacular cells, the supporting cells. So when COVID comes into the picture, the virus has spike proteins that come off, and the spike protein's actually what binds, and it has to bind to the ACE2 enzyme. So when it binds to that ACE2 enzyme, it gets internalized into the cell, and it starts, replicating and destroying the cell. When these supportive cells break down, and they're so closely related to the olfactory neurons themselves will start to be dysfunctional. So they won't express as many receptors. They stop gene expression of the receptors on the cilia that pick up the odorants. And if they don't have receptors, you're not going to smell. And we know that smell and taste, they converge so many different places in the cortex that if you can't smell, it's obviously going to affect the flavor of the food as well. So just to recap, we have olfactory neurons that have these cilia that pick up odorants, and they have to have their receptors there for the odorants to bind to cause an action potential that'll travel up to the olfactory nerve. And they're supported by these red cells called sustentacular cells, which express angiotensin converting enzyme 2 on their cell's membrane surface. And that's what the spike protein of the COVID virus binds to right there, and they'll form a complex, and then it'll get internalized into the cell, destroy these supporting cells, which cause dysfunction of the closely related olfactory neurons. They down-regulate gene expression of their odorant receptors, and so that's going to decrease our smell, which is called anosmia.